Richard M. Nixon became the president in 1969. His primary foreign policy advisor was Henry Kissinger, who later served as his Secretary of State. Kissinger's foreign policy was guided by a philosophy known as Realpolitik. This implies that foreign policy choices should be based on power rather than ideals or moral principles. Kissinger thought it was practical to ignore weaker countries, but necessary to interact with stronger nations. This marked a change from the previous containment policy. During the Nixon and Kissinger era, the United States adopted a new strategy known as Détente. This approach sought to reduce tensions with communist nations and bring an end to the hostilities of the Cold War. In 1972, President Nixon made a significant visit to communist China, even though the government had previously been unrecognized. After 3 months, he went to the Soviet Union and signed the SALT I treaty. This treaty limited nuclear weapons for a period of 5 years. Nixon's re-election was aided by his diplomatic achievements in foreign affairs. Furthermore, Nixon began secret operations in Chile to combat the communist threat in that nation. Additionally, he offered military assistance to Israel, while Kissinger actively pursued a peace accord in the Middle East. As a result, a ceasefire was established between Israel and Egypt, and subsequently with Syria. Nixon's actions in foreign policy had a big effect on the world while he was president. After Richard Nixon, Gerald R. Ford became the president. He followed a foreign policy that aimed to stop communism from spreading. He also kept Henry Kissinger as the Secretary of State. During his time in office, Ford engaged in discussions with China and the Soviet Union. He attended a meeting in Helsinki, Finland in 1974. During this meeting, 35 countries, including the Soviet Union, signed the Helsinki Accords. These agreements pledged to enhance cooperation among European nations. Nevertheless, difficulties continued to arise in Southeast Asia. Although Ford asked for financial assistance to aid South Vietnam in their fight against the communist North Vietnamese, Congress declined, leading to South Vietnam's eventual surrender to the North in 1975. Ford approved airstrikes on Cambodia in response to the seizure of American merchant ships by Communist Cambodia. Ford encountered difficulties in Africa as well. The United States military got involved in the Civil War in Angola, a country where 3 different political organizations were trying to gain control. The conflict received international attention as the United States supported 2 groups and the Soviet Union and China supported the third. Nevertheless, Congress chose not to participate in another foreign conflict, leading to the eventual rise of a Marxist regime in Angola. Gerald R. Ford and Jimmy Carter were candidates in the 1976 presidential election. Carter portrayed himself as an outsider, someone who was not involved in the established political scene in Washington. His keen interest in human rights greatly shaped his decisions regarding foreign policy. Carter was very worried about how the Soviet Union treated its opponents in the government, and this caused tensions in relations with the Soviet Union. Carter's focus on human rights caused a delay in negotiations for a second strategic arms limitation treaty, SALT II. This treaty aimed to limit the production of strategic weapons and nuclear missile launchers by both sides. In 1979, Carter and Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev signed the SALT II agreement. Regrettably, the treaty encountered opposition within the Senate. The situation worsened when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in December 1979. As a result, Carter decided to retract his support for the SALT II agreement, and the Senate never officially approved it. During Carter's presidency, the invasion of Afghanistan caused additional tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. Ronald Reagan assumed the presidency in 1980 and held firm opposition towards communism. He played a major part in ending the Cold War during his time as president. Reagan developed a cooperative bond with Mikhail Gorbachev, who held the position of General Secretary of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. Reagan raised U.S. defense spending to put pressure on the Soviets and weaken their economy. Additionally, he began efforts to include nuclear warheads in the United States weapons collection and pursued the creation of a unique defense system known as the Strategic Defense Initiative. The purpose of this initiative was to safeguard Americans from hostile missiles. However, it had a negative impact on the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union, ultimately causing them to terminate discussions on arms control. In the Soviet Union, Gorbachev implemented policies called glasnost, which means openness, and perestroika, which means economic restructuring. These reforms permitted individuals to own land privately, encouraged greater freedom of expression, and facilitated the conduct of free elections. Gorbachev's desire to negotiate and enhance relations with the United States resulted in successful discussions, leading to the signing of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF, in 1987. Gorbachev urged the satellite nations of East Germany and Eastern Europe to embrace democracy. The Soviet Union eventually collapsed due to a combination of his reforms and economic challenges. The republics that were once part of the Soviet Union gained independence and later joined together in a loose confederation known as the Commonwealth of Independent States. The Soviet Union's collapse signaled the conclusion of the Cold War. The START II treaty was signed by Russia and the United States in January 1993. This treaty aimed to decrease the number of nuclear weapons held by both countries by 2/3. George H.W. Bush served as the President of the United States during this time. Russian voters elected a new parliament and approved a new constitution in December 1993. Some parts of the constitution were similar to the United States Constitution.